Imagine waking up tomorrow and no longer feeling anxious about other people and what they thought of what you did and how you acted and what you were. Imagine being free just to do whatever you wanted, that you weren't held back by fear of other people and what they thought. I mean, for some of us that sounds impossible, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not, and in this video I'm going to show you how somebody finally got free of what others think, because they discovered this really liberating, vital truth, and you can use the same truth to let go of fear today. So yeah, how to finally stop caring what others think. Let's dive into it. Welcome to A Little Nudge. My name is Derek, and for the last 3 decades I've been helping people explore faith and relate it to their ordinary everyday life. And in these videos I'm just giving you some nudges, some tools to help you live a deeper and a more meaningful life. So I'm a big Ali Abdaal fan. He's a YouTuber. He teaches people how to create YouTube videos, and I did his course and he's taught me a lot of things that I'm using in these videos, and he tells people lots of tips and tools about how to grow on YouTube. But he finds a number of people do his course and never start a YouTube channel, or they start a YouTube channel, make a couple of videos and then quit. And they all face the same barrier that tends to be really big in their lives. And the thing that holds them back is simply worrying what other people are thinking about them. They're putting a video like this out there and people might laugh at them or mock them. And I wonder if you're the same, if there's dreams or things that you'd love to do, but you're being held back because you're worrying what other people will think and how they will see you. Parsons heads up a charity in the UK here, and he's a speaker and he wanders around and he often does talks and people talk to him afterwards. And he recounts a time this 40-year-old guy come up to him really well dressed in a suit, and he spoke to Rob privately afterwards, and he said this to him. He said, "Listen, I'm a director of my own company. I've got 200 people who work for me. I've got 3 kids who've grown up and they're doing really well. Anybody who looks at me will think that I'm very successful and I've achieved all the things I want to." And he looks at Rob in the eye with a slight tear and he says, "Could you please help me understand then why I'm still trying to prove myself to my dad?" And so many of us, it could be fear of what strangers think, it could be fear of what our close family think, our parents, boss, teacher. We can be held back from doing the things we really want to. But for some of us, actually, what happens is we're not held back, but we're driven forward almost to the point of exhaustion and overwork, because we're trying hard to create an impression for other people. We're trying to get people to like us, to approve us, to show that we are somebody. And there's a very famous quote from Madonna, who's the best female artist of all time. You know, she's won 7 Grammys, 2 Globe Awards, and she was interviewed in Vanity Fair magazine, and this is what she said about pleasing others and fearing what others think. Let me read this quote from you in full because it's so powerful. From Madonna, best-selling female artist of all time. She said, "My drive in life is from this horrible fear of being mediocre. And that's always pushing me on, because even though I've become somebody, I still have to prove that I'm somebody. And my struggle has never ended, and it probably never will. It's been to conquer that horrible feeling of inadequacy. I'm always struggling with that fear." Even though she won all these awards and best-selling artist, etc., she's still driven on by that. And I mean, it can be exhausting, and I don't know which of those you struggle with, maybe both of them, but could you imagine if we could get to the point of not really being affected by what others thought of us? You know, close people or strangers, that we could start to do the things we want to do. We could pursue our dreams or whatever it might be, or we could relax. And we don't have to achieve to prove ourselves. We don't have to dress a certain way, make a certain amount of money, do a certain job. We could just have that inner freedom. Sounds impossible almost, doesn't it? Now, the Apostle Paul, who was one of the early church leaders, he wrote this really interesting document, a letter in the 1st century, which is really helpful for us. It's so wise, the things that he says. And he writes this letter to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 4, and he's in a position where there's lots of different leaders around in the church. There's Apollos, there's Peter, there's Paul, and different groups are aligning themselves with each leader. And so there's almost this conflict and judgment about who's the best leader, etc. And Paul's under a lot of pressure. And this is what he says in response to that. 1 Corinthians 4 verse 3. He says, "As for me, it matters very little how I might be judged by you or any human authority. He's like, I've arrived at the point where actually what you think of me or any humans think of me just doesn't matter anymore. Oh, imagine that sort of freedom. And you can imagine, like, I mean, I don't know if you've ever met any insecure leaders. Insecure leaders are the worst. They're easily threatened. Maybe you've had managers like that. And they can be so vulnerable by other things. But Paul's saying actually he's free from that. What people think of him don't matter. It doesn't affect him. He's got this inner freedom. Now, what our culture would say is the way to get that, to not think about other people, is to think the only thing that matters what you think of you. If you're happy doing that, then that's fine. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. But Paul in the next verse says this. He says, I don't even trust my own judgment on this point. What you think about me doesn't matter, and actually what I think of me doesn't matter. And this is like a really crucial insight, because when you think actually the way to freedom is not to worry about what anybody else thinks, and the way to get that is to just be bothered about what I think, and then just think positive thoughts about myself, you might have found that that doesn't work, because you know you better than anyone else. You know your like secrets and your flaws, and even when you like perform things and do things in meetings or groups or conversations, you know what's going on inside you. So usually our judgment of ourselves is harsher than anybody else. So to kind of rely on that when we know more about ourselves and our failure and our flaws is a reason that that doesn't work. And actually, our opinion of ourselves really varies, doesn't it? We have this roller coaster where we're really prideful and we think we're amazing and better than everybody else. And then we think that we're like worse than everybody else. And we think shameful and guilty thoughts about ourselves. And we tend to swing this roller coaster of two ends. We don't have this steady middle. So relying on ourselves doesn't bring freedom at all. It leads to actually a lot more chains. So here's where Paul's freedom comes from. How he's free from what others think. He's free from what he thinks. He says it in the next verse. He says this. It's God. It's Lord himself who will examine me and decide. He says, actually, I don't worry about your judgment. I don't worry about my judgment. Actually, the only thing that bothers me is God's judgment. Now, stay with me. I know that that sounds like bad news. You know, a lot of people fear God's judgment. They fear, like, God thinks they're terrible, etc. And they think that it's no solution at all. But you need to understand what's going on for Paul here. That he's talking about, like, judgment language. He's talking like courtroom. You know the idea of courtroom, and there's the prosecution and the defense. And he says it's like that for us. We're in a courtroom. And our opinion of ourselves and other people's opinion of us is back and forth all the time. Sometimes there's good evidence for us because we behave really well. Sometimes there's bad evidence because we fail and we let ourselves down. And it's like we're on trial every day. And sometimes we're up, sometimes we're down. Sometimes, you know, we don't always fear others. Sometimes we have good days when we're quite brave and courageous. But then on other days we fear. And we have this kind of back and forth side that we're on a trial forever. But Paul is saying actually the trial for him is over because the verdict has already been cast. And if you imagine for Paul, he's like in this trial, and for him the judgment is that he's fallen short of who he's supposed to be. You know, the language in the Bible is that we're a sinner, that we've fallen short of who we're supposed to be. And he's accepted that judgment. Paul's like, I'm accepted that I'm guilty. I'm not who I'm called to be. I've fallen short of who God. All the flaws and failures are true. I'm not going to do positive thinking. And that's how it is. And he's accepted that. But then that's not the end of the story, because the whole thing about Jesus and Jesus coming is to take our place in the courtroom of life, as it were. And so we get guilty, charged guilty that we're not good enough. And then Jesus lives the perfect life. And what he does essentially is he offers an exchange. That's why he comes, his death and his resurrection. He says, well, you can have my perfect life and I'll take your, crappy failure life. And that's kind of what happened on the cross. And then the verdict is guilty, but Jesus pays the price. And then we walk out the courtroom and it's all over and it's all done. That's why, like in another letter, Paul writes in Romans 8 verse 1, he says, there's no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. That when you've accepted Jesus' verdict of innocence and you take that for yourself, whenever God looks at you, he sees you're totally acceptable because you've accepted Jesus' purity, as it were. And so for Paul, what happens then for Paul is he lives from acceptance, not for acceptance. Yeah, he knows there's no condemnation, that God's accepted him. And so then he's free to live the best life he can. And when you've had a courtroom and the verdict's been cast, and if you go into the courtroom the next day and you just sit in the dock, there's like nobody there. And someone comes in and your trial was over yesterday, there was a verdict, someone's paid the price, it's all over, you're free to go. But some of us, we keep putting ourselves on trial. But for Paul, he's experienced that freedom because he's lent into this idea that God accepts him, not because he's a good person, but because Jesus is a good person, and he's accepted that trait. So whenever God looks at him, he sees the purity and the goodness of Jesus that Jesus has given him, my Jesus pass mark, and Paul gives his failure to Jesus. It's like a trade, and that's the whole thing about following Jesus. It's not like a religion where you got to follow all these rules and stuff. It's you live from acceptance, not for acceptance. And Paul's in this position where there's all these leaders and they've all got tribes and people following, and he normally a leader would be insecure, but Paul is free in that moment because he's living from the acceptance that he's already received from God. And for many years I struggled with my own sense of self-worth and whether I mattered and how valuable I felt and all that sort of stuff. And if you have any issues around that, then you want to watch this video next, because I just talk through how I fix my own self-worth problem and which truths kind of give me freedom in that way. But I hope today's video helps you to finally stop caring and being free from what other people think about you. And thanks for watching, and hopefully catch you on the next one. Thanks. Bye-bye.